No one would buy her, abandoned without clothes in a Wild West market, until a rancher saw her. In the middle of a dusty Wild West market town, a cold wind swept through the streets, carrying with it the sounds of horses' hooves clopping along the dirt road and the chatter of traders trying to make a sale. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. The air smelled of livestock and fresh produce, and the chatter of locals filled the space as people bargained, laughed, and haggled over goods. Among them, however, was one figure that seemed out of place, a young woman standing by herself in the midst of the market. She was no different from the other women of the town, except for the way she stood there, alone and uncertain, with no one to help her. Her clothes, once vibrant, now looked worn and torn. The hem of her dress was frayed, and the fabric had faded from exposure to the harsh sun. She looked fragile, as though the weight of the world had pressed down on her, leaving her unable to stand tall like the others around her. Her hair, a tangled mess of brown strands, fell loosely around her shoulders, the wind tugging at it every so often. The woman shivered from both the chill of the wind and the emptiness that seemed to creep inside her. She had no belongings, no coat, no shawl, no purse. She was empty-handed, without any means of support, and yet she was still standing in the middle of the marketplace, as if she had nowhere else to go. Her eyes scanned the busy scene, filled with people carrying baskets, carts, and boxes. The men and women moved swiftly from stall to stall, exchanging money for goods. No one spared her a glance. It wasn't that they didn't see her, rather it was that they chose to ignore her. It was easier to pretend she wasn't there, easier to carry on with their lives than to acknowledge someone like her, someone who had been abandoned and left to fend for herself in this unforgiving land. The market bustled with activity, but the woman stood still, frozen in place, as though she feared that any movement would draw unwanted attention. Her stomach rumbled with hunger, but she knew better than to approach any of the stalls. She had no money, no way to pay for the food that was laid out before her. The thought of begging crossed her mind briefly, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had no pride left to lose. The chill of the wind bit at her skin, and she hugged her arms tightly to her chest, trying to keep warm. The fabric of her dress offered little protection against the cold, and she could feel the chill seeping into her bones. Her only shelter from the harsh weather had been the shade of a nearby awning, but as the sun continued to set, the shadows grew longer, and the warmth of the day began to slip away, leaving behind the biting chill of nightfall. Her mind was filled with confusion and pain. How had it come to this? How had she ended up in a town like this, without anyone to care for her, without any place to turn? She tried to remember how long she had been standing there, but time seemed to blur together. Hours, days, weeks, it was hard to say. The days had started to feel like an endless cycle of survival, where she moved from one place to another, trying to find shelter, trying to find food, trying to find any sense of normalcy. But there was none to be found. She had once had a family, once had a home, once had a life. But that life felt like a distant memory now, a time long past, buried under layers of pain and loss. She had been abandoned here alone in this town with nothing but her will to survive. There was no one to ask for help, no one to turn to for comfort. The faces that passed by her were all unfamiliar, all strangers. Some of them gave her curious glances, but no one approached her. She could feel the weight of their judgment as they looked at her, the way they saw her as nothing more than a broken woman, someone who had nothing to offer. She had seen it in their eyes, in the way they quickly turned away when their gaze met hers. She couldn't blame them. Who would want to help someone like her? Someone who had nothing, who had lost everything. As she stood there, a deep sense of loneliness washed over her. The market was full of people, yet she felt as though she was the only one in the world. She could hear the laughter of children running past her, the clinking of coins exchanged for goods, the neigh of horses pulling carts. Yet all of it felt distant, as though she was watching it from the outside, separated by an invisible wall. She was alone in the crowd, just one person among many, and yet she was invisible to them all. The wind howled through the streets again, and the woman closed her eyes for a moment, wishing for the warmth of home, for the safety of being surrounded by those who loved her. But there was no home now. There was no love, just the cold and the uncertainty of the future. She had heard rumors of a rancher who came to town from time to time, someone who would buy livestock or supplies. But she wasn't sure if that was true, or if it was just another tale whispered among the townspeople. She couldn't imagine anyone being kind enough to help her, to take her in from the cold and offer her a chance at a new life. It was hard to believe in that kind of kindness when all she had known was neglect and pain. Yet as she stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't sure where it had come from, but it was there, small and fragile like a candle flickering in the dark. Maybe someone would notice her. Maybe someone would take pity on her. Maybe someone would offer her the help she so desperately needed. She didn't know who it might be or when it might happen, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But as the minutes passed and the sun sank lower in the sky, she began to realize that no one was going to come for her. The faces around her remained as indifferent as ever, and she knew she would have to face the cold night on her own. She took a deep breath and straightened her back. If no one was going to help her, then she would have to help herself. She had no choice but to keep going, to keep moving, to keep fighting for survival. She would survive just like she always had. And with that, she took one step forward into the uncertain night. The evening had settled over the Wild West town like a heavy blanket. The sounds of the market had faded, replaced by the creaking of wooden doors closing and the soft rustling of the wind. The sun had long disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the streets bathed in shadows. The only light now came from lanterns hanging outside a few buildings, casting flickering pools of light on the dirt roads. It was in this dimness that the woman stood, still in the middle of the marketplace, feeling the weight of the cold creeping into her bones. Her fingers were stiff from the chill, and her teeth clattered together as she tried to keep herself warm. She had no idea where to go. The streets seemed emptier now, and the town that had once felt so bustling and alive now seemed so distant. People had retreated to their homes, leaving her to stand alone, exposed with nothing but the night to keep her company. It was as if the world had gone to sleep, and she had been forgotten in the silence. As the wind howled down the streets, she wrapped her arms tighter around her body, desperately trying to hold onto the little warmth she had left. Her stomach growled louder now, its hunger more insistent, but she ignored it. There was nothing to eat here, not for someone like her. She couldn't ask for food from a stranger, and there was no place she could go to find refuge. She was an outsider in this town, invisible to everyone who passed by. The thought of finding shelter was enough to make her shoulders slump. She had tried asking for help before, but all she had received were cold stares, harsh words, or worse, no reaction at all. She had been invisible long before this night, long before she had ended up here, alone in a foreign town, with no place to go. She had grown used to the silence, to the feeling of being a forgotten soul. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. It still stung, still made her feel small, like she was nothing. The thought of trying to find a place to stay, even for the night, seemed impossible. She could hardly imagine what it would be like to sleep under a roof again. The last few weeks had been nothing but wandering from one place to the next, searching for a safe place to rest her head. But there had been no rest, only the constant worry of where her next meal would come from, where she would find safety, and whether she would make it through the night. As her eyes scanned the town's empty streets, something inside her stirred. She couldn't just stay here. She couldn't wait for someone else to notice her, to pity her enough to offer help. She had waited for too long already. She needed to take control of her situation, to make a choice. She wasn't going to sit around and wait for the world to change for her. She had to keep moving to find some way to survive. Her feet ached, and she could feel the weight of exhaustion settling in her bones. She had been walking for days, always moving, always searching. But her steps were slow now, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Every time she took a step forward, she felt the cold bite deeper into her skin, and the world seemed to grow a little darker. She had been living in survival mode for so long that it was hard to remember what it was like to feel anything else. To feel hope or safety or even joy. Those emotions had been long gone, replaced by the need to keep moving, to find the next step, to find the next chance to make it through another day. But despite the darkness that surrounded her, despite the loneliness that seemed to stretch on forever, there was a spark inside her, a small flicker of something that refused to die. She wasn't sure what it was, hope maybe, or just the will to survive, but it was there and it pushed her forward. She took a deep breath and made her way toward the edge of the market. There had to be somewhere she could go, somewhere she could find a safe place to sleep. She could hear the sounds of horses moving in the distance and the occasional creak of a wagon wheel, but there was no one nearby. She was alone. Turning a corner, she spotted a building that seemed like it might offer some sort of shelter. It was an old structure, its wooden walls weathered by years of wind and rain. The windows were dark, but there was a flicker of light coming from the cracks in the door. It looked like it might be an inn or some sort of lodging place. She hesitated. It was a risk, she knew. She had no money, no way of paying for a room, but what choice did she have? She couldn't just stand out here all night. The cold would kill her before the morning came. She approached the door cautiously, trying to listen for any sounds inside. She could hear muffled voices, low and indistinct, but there was no sign of anyone coming to greet her. With a shaky breath, she reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The warm air hit her like a wave, and for a moment she just stood there, taking in the heat. It was a welcome change from the biting cold outside. Inside, the room was filled with a few people sitting at wooden tables, laughing softly and talking in hushed tones. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the faces of the patrons. There was a quiet comfort in the room, a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in so long. She stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind her. As soon as she did, the conversation stopped, and a few eyes turned to look at her. She stood there, unsure of what to do, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she belonged here, wasn't sure if anyone would welcome her. But she needed help. She needed shelter. The bartender, a man in his 40s with a thick beard, raised an eyebrow when he saw her. He didn't say anything at first, just studied her with a gaze that seemed both curious and wary. The woman took a deep breath, her nerves on edge. She had to say something, had to ask for help. But what could she say? I need a place to stay, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The bartender nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as if weighing her request. The room was silent, all eyes now fixed on her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everyone could see through her, see the desperation in her eyes. Do you have money? The bartender asked gruffly. The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She shook her head, her face flushing with embarrassment. No, she admitted quietly, her hands trembling. The bartender stared at her for a long moment, and for a brief second she thought he might ask her to leave. But then something shifted in his expression, and he sighed. All right, he said, his voice softening. You can stay for the night, but you'll need to work for your supper. The woman blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. He gestured toward a small table by the fire. Sit down. I'll bring you something to eat, he said, and with that, he turned away, leaving her standing there, unsure of what had just happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She had found a place to rest, a place where she could sleep without fear of the cold. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for now, that was all she needed. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth seemed to sink deep into her bones, providing comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. She settled into the chair by the fire, feeling the heat on her cold skin. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. It felt strange, as if she were floating between the safety of the present and the uncertainty of her past. The shadows from the fire danced on the walls, flickering with every small shift of the wood, creating a peaceful, almost magical ambience. As the bartender walked away, she glanced around the room, taking in the other patrons. The inn wasn't large, just a few tables scattered about, with some people gathered in small groups, chatting softly. Their voices were warm, not like the harsh whispers she had been used to. They didn't seem to notice her, not in the way others in town had. It was as if they accepted her presence without judgment, without the unspoken question of who she was or why she was there. She wasn't sure why this felt different, but it did. It was a small relief to be in a space where she wasn't scrutinized at every moment. The bartender returned shortly after with a bowl of stew and a slice of bread. He placed it in front of her with a silent nod. The steam rising from the stew filled the air with a comforting aroma that made her stomach growl louder than ever. She hesitated for a moment before picking up the spoon. She hadn't realized just how hungry she was until now, when the food was right in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she scooped a spoonful of the stew and brought it to her mouth. The first bite was warm and satisfying, a burst of flavor that seemed to spread throughout her whole body. It tasted better than anything she had eaten in what felt like forever. The bread, though plain, was soft and filling. She didn't know when she had last felt this full, this nourished. For the briefest moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and savor the food, to feel something more than just the emptiness inside her. As she ate, she couldn't help but feel a little self-conscious. The other patrons were still talking, but she could feel their eyes occasionally drifting toward her. She wondered if they were curious about who she was or why she had come in. She had never been good at fitting in, never been good at blending into the background. But here it felt different. No one seemed to stare or make her feel out of place. They were just going about their business as if she were as ordinary as anyone else. The bartender, noticing that she was finished with her meal, approached her again. "You're welcome to stay for as long as you need," he said kindly. "No charge for the night, but if you want to stay longer, I'll need you to help out. We don't have much, but there's always something to be done." The woman blinked in surprise. It wasn't the kind of offer she had expected. She had been ready to leave at first light, to pick up and continue on her way, but now she was uncertain. The idea of staying, of finding a small piece of stability, seemed almost too good to be true. It wasn't that she was afraid of work. She had worked before, and she had worked hard, but it was the idea of belonging somewhere that unsettled her. She wasn't used to it, wasn't sure if she even deserved it. But here in this warm room with the fire crackling and the smell of food in the air, it didn't feel so impossible. "I'll help," she said quietly, looking up at him. "I'll do whatever I can." The bartender nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear. There's always something that needs doing around here, keeping the place tidy, helping out with the horses, running small errands for the town. It's nothing fancy, but it's honest work." She didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what to expect. She had always been on the move, surviving by whatever means necessary. The idea of a routine, a schedule, felt strange but not entirely unwelcome. It would be different than the endless wandering, the uncertainty of each day. But it also felt like she was giving something up, as if by staying, she was somehow attaching herself to something or someone. "I'll start tomorrow," she said, the words coming out more firmly than she felt inside. It wasn't a promise she was sure she could keep, but it was the only choice she had. The bartender smiled slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. "We'll be here same as always. You can stay as long as you need." As the night wore on, the inn slowly quieted. The other patrons began to filter out, heading to their homes or rooms. The soft murmur of conversation faded, and soon the only sounds left were the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the building. She felt her eyelids growing heavy, and the exhaustion that had been with her for so long finally caught up to her. The days and nights of wandering, of not knowing where she would sleep, were taking their toll. The bartender returned to the counter, and she felt the weight of his gaze once again. But this time, it was different. He wasn't watching her like a stranger, judging her, or wondering why she had ended up here. Instead, he was just watching her, as if waiting for her to make her next move, to decide what she would do with the opportunity she had been given. She stood up slowly, gathering her things. The warmth of the room was soothing, but she knew she needed to sleep. She needed rest, and the bed upstairs offered a place where she could forget the worries of the day. She made her way toward the stairs, her legs heavy, her mind still swirling with thoughts about what the next day would bring. The bartender nodded as she passed him. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know if he could hear the uncertainty in her words, but she didn't feel the need to explain herself. She had been given a chance, and it was all she could do to hold on to it. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it. She climbed the stairs to the small room above the inn. It wasn't much, just a simple bed with plain white linens, but it felt like luxury to her. She hadn't slept in a bed in so long. The soft mattress was a relief to her aching body, and as she lay down, she closed her eyes and let herself drift into sleep. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she might be able to rest. She was no longer alone in the wilderness, no longer a stranger in a strange land. She was here in this moment with a chance to build something again. And for now, that was enough. The morning light poured through the small window in her room, the soft golden rays making the dust motes in the air shimmer like tiny stars. The woman stirred, slowly waking from a night of deep, much-needed sleep. For a moment, she just lay there, listening to the sounds of the inn waking up around her. She could hear the creaking of the floorboards downstairs, the quiet murmur of voices, and the clink of dishes being set on the counter. It was a far cry from the silence and uncertainty of the last few weeks, where every morning had been a struggle to survive, to find something to eat, a safe place to sleep. For a brief moment, she almost couldn't believe she was here, in this small, warm room tucked away from the harshness of the world outside. She felt the softness of the bed beneath her, the comfort of the thick quilt, and the warmth from the hearth. She hadn't had a bed like this in so long, a bed that was hers, a place where she didn't have to worry about the next step, about surviving the night. Here in this inn, she felt safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. With a sigh, she stretched her arms above her head, feeling the muscles in her back and shoulders loosen with the movement. The exhaustion of the past few days still lingered in her body, but it wasn't the same kind of bone-deep tiredness she had grown used to. It was a tiredness that could be rested, healed, something that would pass with time. She felt a small flicker of something inside her, hope, perhaps, or just the quiet relief of finding a place where she could finally catch her breath. She sat up, the room spinning slightly for a moment as she adjusted to being awake. She glanced around, taking in the simplicity of her surroundings. The room was small, with only a bed, a wooden chair, and a simple nightstand. The walls were plain, but there was a sense of calm in the simplicity. The air smelled faintly of wood, wax, and the lingering warmth of the fire downstairs. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in a while. She stood up, her legs a little stiff from the unfamiliar comfort of the bed, and walked over to the window. She pulled back the heavy curtain and looked out at the town below. The streets were still quiet, the hustle of the market yet to begin. It was still early, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The town seemed peaceful, a far cry from the dusty roads she had traveled, the wild, untamed land that had been her home for so long. As she turned away from the window, she noticed a small table by the door. On it was a piece of paper and a pencil, the kind you might use to leave a note. There was something written on it, and she picked it up curiously. It was from the bartender, a simple note that read, "Breakfast is on the counter. If you're ready to help, there's work to be done." The words were kind, but there was a quiet sense of expectation behind them. The work wouldn't be easy, she knew that. It never was. But it was work that would give her something to focus on, something to do beyond the uncertainty that had plagued her for so long. She folded the note and put it in her pocket. She didn't hesitate. She had made the decision to stay here to work, and that's exactly what she was going to do. There was a sense of purpose in that, something to cling to after so much wandering. She had always known how to survive, how to make do with what little she had, but now she would learn how to build something more than just survival. She would learn how to live. She opened the door and made her way downstairs, feeling the coolness of the wooden stairs beneath her feet. The inn smelled of fresh bread and something savory, and as she entered the main room, she found the bartender standing behind the counter, wiping down glasses. The warmth from the fire and the scent of food filled the space, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt her stomach settle with anticipation. "Morning," the bartender greeted her with a smile. His face was weathered but kind, and there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. He didn't ask if she was ready, he already knew. "Breakfast is ready for you," she nodded, her own smile a little shy. She wasn't used to being treated like this, like someone was actually looking out for her. It was a strange feeling, but one that she had begun to grow accustomed to. The food was simple but hearty, eggs, bread, and some cooked vegetables. Nothing fancy, but it was more than enough. She sat down at one of the tables near the fire, feeling the warmth of the room and the food fill her up in a way that had little to do with the meal itself. It was the feeling of being cared for, of being noticed. Something she hadn't experienced in a long time. As she ate, the bartender came over, setting down a pitcher of water and a few mugs on the counter. "There's a wagon full of supplies coming into town today," he said casually. "Could use an extra pair of hands if you're willing." She didn't hesitate. "I'll help," she said, her voice firm. She was ready for this, ready to put herself to work, ready to earn her place in this town, even if it was just for a little while. "Good," he said, giving her a nod of approval. "I'll show you what needs to be done when the wagon gets here. It's not much, just unloading and sorting the supplies. Shouldn't take long." She finished her meal, feeling more grounded with each passing moment. It was strange how something as simple as a meal and a task could make her feel like she was beginning to rebuild herself, like she had a purpose beyond just existing. She wasn't sure how long she would stay here or what would happen in the days ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice in the matter. She could decide what came next, even if it was just the smallest step forward. After finishing her meal, she stood up and helped clear the table, just as she had been taught to do all those years ago. She moved quickly, her hands steady with the familiarity of routine. It felt good, almost comforting, to do something so simple, to take part in something bigger than herself. She didn't realize how much she had missed it until now. The bartender seemed pleased with her eagerness to work. He showed her the door to the back of the inn, where the supplies were stacked. She was ready for whatever came next, ready to do her part, to show that she could contribute, that she wasn't just someone waiting to be helped. As she stepped outside, she took a deep breath of the cool morning air, the sky now clear and wide above her. The town was waking up, the sounds of the market slowly beginning to fill the air again. She looked around at the familiar faces of the people she had passed earlier. Some of them waved to her, a nod of acknowledgement that made her feel like she belonged here, even if just for a short while. The wagon arrived shortly after, pulled by two strong horses. The driver, a burly man with a thick beard, waved as he hopped down from the wagon. "Morning," he called. "Got some heavy stuff here, could use some help." The woman nodded and stepped forward, ready to get to work. And just like that, the day began. It wasn't a grand adventure, no sweeping moment of revelation, but it was enough. It was a start, and that for her was enough. The days passed quickly, almost faster than the woman could keep up with. Each morning, she awoke early to the sounds of the inn stirring to life. The soft creak of the floorboards as the bartender moved around, the quiet chatter of a few early risers, and the warmth of the fire already burning in the hearth. The routine had settled into her life like a second skin, comforting and familiar. It wasn't the chaotic rush she had once known, the struggle to survive from day to day. Now there was time to work, time to rest, time to breathe. She had spent the past few days working in the inn, helping with small chores and running errands for the bartender. The tasks were simple, but they filled her days with purpose. Each evening, after finishing her work, she would sit by the fire, feeling the warmth of the flames on her face and the satisfaction of a job well done. The other patrons, those who stayed at the inn regularly, had become more familiar with her. They didn't treat her like a stranger anymore. They greeted her with smiles and polite conversation, asking her how her day had been or offering a kind word here and there. It was a small thing, but it made her feel like she was part of something again, like she wasn't invisible. She had also started helping with the horses. The bartender owned a few animals, and they needed tending to every day. The woman didn't know much about horses, but she learned quickly, taking care to feed them and clean the stalls. She enjoyed the work, finding peace in the rhythm of caring for the animals. It was honest labor, something she could do with her hands, something that required focus and attention. There was no time for worrying about the past or what the future might hold. When she was with the horses, there was only the present, only the task at hand. The bartender had noticed her growing confidence and skill, and he often asked for her help with tasks that required a little more knowledge. One day, he asked her if she would be willing to help him run a small errand to the nearby town. The task was simple. He needed supplies from the general store, and it would only take a few hours. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of task that felt like a step forward. She agreed without hesitation, eager for the chance to get out of the inn for a while, to see something beyond the walls she had become so familiar with. The next morning, they set out on foot, the sun already high in the sky as they walked along the dirt path that led out of the town. The journey was short, just a couple of miles, but it was enough for her to feel the sense of freedom she hadn't realized she missed. The landscape around them was vast, open fields stretching out in every direction, with the distant mountains looming on the horizon. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that made her feel small, yet oddly at peace with it all. As they walked, the bartender talked about his life, about the inn, and about the people in town. He didn't ask her much about her past, respecting her silence on the matter, but every so often he would throw out a casual question, as if testing the waters, seeing if she might open up. She didn't, but she didn't mind his questions either. He wasn't intrusive, just quietly patient. She wasn't sure if he truly cared about her past or if he just wanted to make conversation. Either way, it was a relief not to be forced to explain herself. By the time they reached the store, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat was starting to build. The store was small, tucked away at the edge of the town, but it was well stocked with all the essentials, a little bit of everything. The bartender greeted the shopkeeper, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes. They exchanged pleasantries, and the bartender handed over a list of supplies they needed. The woman watched them for a moment, feeling like an outsider once again, unsure of her place in this quiet, small world. While the bartender and the shopkeeper discussed prices and quantities, the woman wandered outside, her eyes drifting over the small town. It was different from the bustling market she had come from, quieter, slower. The buildings were simple, their walls made of wood and stone, with small porches and simple gardens. There were a few children playing in the dirt, their laughter echoing through the streets, and a couple of older men sitting on the porch of a nearby building, watching the world pass by. It was a peaceful place, one that seemed far removed from the chaos of the world she had once known. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in her thoughts, when she heard the shopkeeper call her name. The woman turned to find the bartender walking toward her, carrying a small bundle of supplies in his arms. "Ready to go?" he asked, a small smile on his face. She nodded, and they began the walk back to the inn, the supplies wrapped up tightly in the bundle between them. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The day was winding down, but there was still so much left to do. As they walked, the woman found herself thinking about how far she had come in just a few days. She had gone from being a stranger, lost and alone, to someone who had a place, a role in this small community. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, as she sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames surrounding her, she thought about what the future might hold. She still didn't know what her place in the world was, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. She had her work at the inn, the horses to tend to, and the people around her who, though they didn't know her fully, accepted her nonetheless. It was the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild herself from the ground up. The future was uncertain, but it didn't feel as frightening anymore. The bartender joined her by the fire later that evening, his face soft with the tiredness of a day's work. They sat in silence for a while, each of them content in the quiet, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, but one filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes no words were necessary. They didn't need to talk about what had been or what would come. For now, the present was enough. As the fire slowly burned down, the woman felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She didn't know how long she would stay here in this town, in this inn, but for now, she was content. She had work to do, a future to build, and people who didn't see her as a burden or an outsider, but simply as someone who belonged. That in itself was enough to keep her going. The days turned into weeks, and the woman found herself falling into a rhythm. The work at the inn became her new routine, something she relied on to fill her days. Each morning, she woke with the sun, and after a quick breakfast, she would help the bartender with whatever tasks needed doing. The first few days had been spent learning how to care for the horses, feed the animals, and clean the stalls. But as time went on, her responsibilities grew. She began to help with the preparation of meals, serve the occasional guest, and even help with small repairs around the inn. The routine felt grounding in a way she hadn't experienced before. There were days when the work felt like too much, days when the exhaustion of physical labor made her question whether she could continue. But there were other days when the simple act of completing a task brought a sense of accomplishment, of peace. Every small chore added up, and with each task completed, she found herself becoming more confident, more comfortable in her role at the inn. She had also started to get to know the other people in town better. The shopkeeper from the general store was one of the first to strike up a conversation with her outside of the inn. A woman in her 50s, with warm brown eyes and a kind smile, she offered to show the woman around town one afternoon. They walked together through the streets, stopping by the small gardens where the townspeople grew flowers and vegetables. The shopkeeper spoke about the history of the town, the people who lived there, and the simple, steady pace of life that marked their days. The woman listened, fascinated by the way the shopkeeper spoke of the town with such pride. It wasn't just the buildings or the land that she loved, it was the sense of community, of belonging. The woman realized that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like an outsider. The people in town had slowly started to accept her, not because she had done anything special, but simply because she had stayed. She had shown up each day, worked hard, and proved that she was willing to be part of something larger than herself. The small acts of kindness she received from the townspeople began to accumulate. When she went to the market to pick up supplies for the inn, the shopkeepers offered her a discount. The children who played in the streets waved at her whenever she passed by, and the other workers at the inn would share a smile or a nod of acknowledgement when their eyes met. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like she belonged. One evening, as she was finishing up her work for the day, the bartender walked over to her with a small bundle of cloth in his arms. "I've noticed you've been working hard," he said, his voice gentle. "I thought you might appreciate something new to wear. You've been here long enough now." He handed her the bundle, and she unwrapped it to find a new dress, simple but clean and made of soft fabric. The color was a deep blue, something that reminded her of the sky on a clear day. Her eyes filled with gratitude, and for a moment she couldn't find the words to express what she felt. No one had given her a gift like this in years. The kindness of it, the thoughtfulness, caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The bartender smiled and nodded. "You've earned it," he replied. That night, after finishing her work, she slipped into the new dress. It felt strange at first, like wearing someone else's life. But as she looked at herself in the small mirror by the door, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: herself. The woman who had been wandering, lost and broken, was starting to emerge from the shadows. She wasn't the same person who had arrived at the inn all those weeks ago. She had changed, grown stronger, more certain of who she was and what she wanted from life. The next morning, she woke early and went outside to tend to the horses. The fresh morning air filled her lungs, and she felt the warmth of the sun beginning to rise in the sky. The world was still quiet, peaceful, and she took a moment to appreciate the stillness. The horses greeted her as usual, nudging her gently with their noses, and she smiled as she fed them. The barn had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could think, reflect, and feel a connection to something real, something tangible. She had found peace in the work. But more than that, she had found a sense of belonging. The people in town had accepted her, not because she had asked for it, but because she had shown up day after day and contributed to the life of the town. She wasn't perfect. She didn't have all the answers. But she was here, and that was enough. Over time, the bartender became a quiet but constant presence in her life. He never pushed her to talk about her past, and he never asked her to explain herself. He simply offered a safe place to work, to rest, and to find a new beginning. His kindness was subtle, unspoken, but it meant more to her than she could put into words. One evening, as the sun began to set and the fire crackled in the hearth, the bartender sat across from her, his face relaxed after a long day of work. The inn was quieter now, the last of the patrons having left for the night. The warmth of the fire filled the room, and the air smelled of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. "I'm glad you stayed," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. "It's not always easy, starting over, but you've done it." The woman looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought I would," she admitted, "but here it feels different. It feels like I can finally breathe." The bartender nodded. "That's all any of us can ask for." In the weeks that followed, the woman continued to work at the inn, finding new responsibilities and challenges. The work kept her busy, but it also kept her grounded. She no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep at night. She had a place here, a small role in the community, and it was enough to make her feel like she was moving forward. Every now and then, she would think back on the days before she came to the inn, the days of wandering, of feeling lost and invisible. But those memories no longer held the same weight. They had become part of her past, something she could look back on, but not something that defined her. She had changed, and she was continuing to change. The future was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of it. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the stables, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see the bartender walking toward her, his face serious but kind. "There's a festival coming up in the next town over," he said. "They're looking for volunteers to help with the preparations. I thought you might like to go." The woman paused, wiping her hands on her apron. The idea of leaving the inn, even for a short time, was strange. She had become so comfortable here, so used to the routine. But the thought of seeing something new, of experiencing life beyond the walls of the inn, filled her with a quiet excitement. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady. "I think I'm ready for it." As she looked at the bartender, she realized something. She was no longer just a woman running from her past. She was someone who had found her place, someone who was building a future. And for the first time in a long time, she was looking forward to what the future might bring.